Good morning, everyone. Today we are going to be talking about problem definition and causal stories, which is at the heart of policy analysis. So we're going to jump right in. At the beginning of every lecture, there will be a slide that looks like this. So after today, you should be able to do the following things. First, you should be able to understand and explain what problem definition is and why it matters. Second, you should be able to understand the differences between a political causal story and a practitioner's problem definition. Next, you should be able to define and explain what a causal story is and what role it plays in policy development. And finally, you should be able to understand different types of causal stories and how they relate to blame and responsibility. The key point about this slide is that these are the things that you will need to be able to do to be successful on the assessment. And so this is your study guide, essentially. These slides provide a list of all of the items that you need to be able to do in order to do well on the assessment. I think this has the advantage of letting you know early what you should be able to do, and so you can check in regularly and say, oh, well, I don't really understand the different types of causal stories. Maybe that's something I need to study more. The other thing I want to point out is that in the lecture, I am covering these topics in broad strokes. So you need to be doing the readings, which are going to cover them in greater depth. Let's jump right in and get started on the material. And so I'm going to flip through some pictures, and I want you to think through whether or not you identify these things as a problem. So homelessness, is this a problem? What about oil fracking or searching for, natural gas and petroleum in non-traditional ways? How about unemployment? Is same-sex marriage a problem or the lack of same-sex marriage a problem? Maybe corporate power. Do you think corporate power is a problem in our society? How about immigration and illegal immigration? Is marijuana a problem? Or is the lack of legalization a problem? How about war and our presence in the Middle East? Is Congress a problem? How you answer these questions are foundational. So maybe there are things that you said, that's really not a problem to me. But if you could see all of the members of the class, if we were in a regular classroom, say, and everyone was raising their hand about whether they believed it to be a problem or not, you would see that there is tremendous variation in whether or not people believe things to be a problem. And if you take that micro example and expand it to the rest of the nation, you see that there are tremendous differences in how we think about issues. So a problem or an issue that's one person identifies as a very serious problem, another person identifies as not a problem at all, or maybe even a benefit. And so this gets at the heart of problem definition. And the question is, does it matter whether we think it's a problem? And the answer is yes, because it dictates many things. So first of all, it dictates whether we should do something about an issue or not. So if you are a leader and you don't think that something is a problem, the likelihood that you're going to pass legislation or allocate funds to address an issue is very low. Whereas if you believe the issue to be a tremendous problem, you're going to be much more likely to act quickly and to give resources to address the issue. But this isn't just about elected officials. It's also about constituents, about the communities in our country and our world, whether they identify things as a problem, whether our culture identifies things as a problem. It also dictates the actions that we consider as a viable response. And what I mean by this is that, so let's take the example of same-sex marriage, which is very big in our political system and in the media right now. And we're going to talk about this a little bit greater depth than, I think, 2 weeks. But you essentially have two different stories about what the problem is. So one group, who tend to be on the more liberal and democratic side, identify the problem as same-sex couples not having the right to wed. The problem is that there isn't an extension of rights, right? So the obvious solution in that case is to extend rights. That is really the only solution if you identify the problem as being a lack of rights. On the other side, people who tend to be more conservative or more Republican identify the problem as the degradation of the traditional family, and that same-sex marriage challenges a traditional family in a way that isn't healthy for society. Now, if that is the way that you view the problem, then really the only logical solution is to limit or ban same-sex marriage and to make sure that you bolster the strength of the traditional family. Now, there may be different approaches to doing those two things, but the way that we think about the problem limits the solution sphere. So maybe on the left, we say, okay, well, we could extend rights through marriage, or we could extend rights through civil unions. We could do this through the courts, or we could do it through the legislature, right? So there are different approaches to actually addressing the issue, actually getting the change. But the policy sphere is limited by the notion that we are going to extend rights. And the reverse is also true. Maybe you limit, you strengthen the family by encouraging, measures, by passing legislation that encourages traditional marriage, or by banning same-sex marriage, or any variety of other things, right? But the sphere of options that you're considering is limited by how you define the problem. Another important thing about whether or not we identify an issue as a problem is that this dictates who we blame for that issue, right? Is it society who is not granting rights, and is it prejudice? That's who's to blame. Or is it these same-sex couples who are quote-unquote immoral and who are degrading society, right? Who is to blame for the problem? And importantly, and related to the who is to blame issue, is who we hold responsible for fixing that problem or paying for the response. And so this is, maybe better thought of in a different example. So if we think about, for example, the issue of homelessness, which we also saw that video, if we identify that the homeless themselves are to blame for their situation, as bad choices, there's drug addiction, that this is personal decisions that led to their situation as being homeless, then who is responsible for paying for it really becomes the individual, and maybe charitable organizations who are committed to these sorts of issues. If, on the other hand, we identify the source of homelessness as being a more communal or systemic problem that results from inequality, from poor health care, from poor mental health care, from poor addiction treatment, etc., then society at large, and as a proxy for society, government, is the more appropriate source of a response to homelessness. So this, we can see, is really important. How we think about a problem is the foundation of policy response. And so we can think about problem definition in two ways. One is from the practitioner perspective, and one is from the political perspective. And you have read, or you should have read, a couple of different things for this week that sort of lay out these two different approaches. All right, so on the practitioner side, what we're talking about in problem definition is the process to identify whether a problem exists and what it looks like. So you think about the practitioner as being someone who is engaged in an analytic process. They are sitting down, and when we transfer the concept from last lecture, right, the policy of or the policy for, so these are looking at what is the problem that this existing policy is trying to address, or what is the problem that we're trying to fix, right? What does it look like? They are attempting to be objective and scientific. And so they're gathering evidence. They're trying not to have a lot of their own opinion in play. They're trying to evaluate, what are the facts? If we connect the facts, what are the conclusions that we should draw? How do we do this in a way that isn't biased towards one group or another? And importantly, the problem definition sets a research agenda. So if you think about the policy analyst as somebody who's sitting in an office and they are trying to understand these complex problems and complex policies, and what they're doing is trying to figure out, what do I need to look at? What do I need to research? So if they're trying to figure out the best solution to a problem, they first have to figure out, hey, what is this problem that we're talking about? Who's affected by it, etc. And given what that problem looks like, what else should I research? This leads to the next step, which is that this research agenda, the policy or the problem, guides an empirical analysis. Okay, and so it is the heart and foundation of policy analysis. What is this problem? And finally, it clarifies the parameters for policy recommendations. And as we just talked about, using the case of same-sex marriage, the way that you define the problem is going to constrain the options that you believe are realistic or desirable for addressing the issue. On the other hand, on the political side, what we're doing is developing a causal story. We're going to talk about in a couple of slides what we mean by a causal story, but you should have also read the reading that discusses this. Right? So we're developing a story that either challenges or protects existing systems. Right? So this is at its very heart political. We are assigning blame. So we're saying we're not being objective. Even though on the policy analyst side, they may eventually say, one group is responsible for this, or government caused this, or the natural disaster caused this problem, whatever. They will eventually assign blame, but it isn't to make a political story, right? On the political side, on the developing a causal story side, we're assigning blame to create a compelling political story. And we're identifying the fixers, right? So not just who is assigning blame, but who is going to fix it, who is responsible for fixing it. And in doing this, we're creating political alliances. The next part of this, right, so in addition to developing a causal story, the problem definition from the political side is using rhetoric and power, right? And they're using this rhetoric and power to, as I mentioned before, tell a story. So they're using devices that we see in the news on a regular basis. For example, they are maybe holding up a political figure that is to blame for passing poor legislation, or they are identifying a company as being the source of a corrupt behavior, or any number of other things, right? But they're using the rhetoric and the power to spread this story. And then finally, they're trying to convince the public and decision makers of their explanation. So a causal story, there are typically competing causal stories, right? One side says, the reason that this problem exists and who should fix it is A. The other side says, no, it's B. Okay? But the point is that you're using this rhetoric and power to convince the public that your causal story is the correct causal story, and therefore the solution that you believe to be the right solution, or your set of potential policies, is the correct one to approach. And so when we think about going back from the political side of things, when we think about policy analysis from the practitioner's perspective, we want to think about this in terms of the scientific method. And so policy analysts use the scientific method to evaluate the policy, to evaluate policy alternatives, to evaluate the problem, to evaluate the outcomes, right? So the first step is we ask a question. Is issue X a problem? Why is it a problem? Who is affected by the problem? What causes the problem? Where is it a problem? Etc., etc., etc. Right? We're trying to understand at its heart what is the source of this issue that we're trying to address. Next, we're doing background research, which means that we're investigating existing measures that are in place to address the problem or issue, or existing measures of the problem. We're doing interviews, analyzing government reports and documents, reading news coverage. We're trying to really get some sort of strong understanding of the answers to our questions. Next, we're constructing a hypothesis. So based on our background research, we believe that problem X is caused by Y. So for example, if we're talking about the economic conditions of a Caribbean island, right, and we say, okay, well, there are poor economic conditions on this island, and what causes it? We look back at the history and we see, oh, well, 30 years ago, Hurricane Hugo came and destroyed the land. And after the hurricane, the cruise ships left, and the people didn't have work, and the society really began to degrade. Well, we might say one of the root causes of this economic problems on this Caribbean island is the historic Hurricane Hugo, right? So that might be what our assumption is when we, after we do this background research, but we're going to test that hypothesis, right? So maybe we gather some data on the ground on this island, and what we realize is that our hypothesis isn't really accurate, that maybe, Hurricane Hugo did have some impact, but aid was received, and so it didn't have that much of an impact. And really, the real source of the economic problems is that a major company closed down, or that there's a lot of gun violence, or that there's not a lot of education, right? So we're looking using data that we collect or else that we gather from the background research to test our hypotheses. And then we are going to draw some conclusions and communicate our results. So in drawing our conclusions, we are taking the data that we analyzed and we are combining it with our background research and whether or not our hypotheses were supported or not supported. And we are coming up with some recommendations, right? So given our research, what would we recommend? And this is very important. Policy analysts, for example, work in all different types of fields. So we have what we would consider to be think tanks, like the Brookings Institute or the Heritage Foundation. So these are groups that are specifically doing research on these topics to be able to make policy recommendations. You have lobbyists who do research like this. We have people in our government who do policy analysis at the state, local, and federal levels. We have people at the university level who do policy analysis. So there are people all over the place who are trying to understand what is the best approach to addressing these issues that face society. But there's this sort of foundational question, which is how we know whether there's a problem or not. So if we think about policy analysis from the practitioner perspective, from the subjective perspective, so we aren't just relying on our own opinion or on our own perspective on this. And so we're asking this question, is there a problem or not? And the way that we address this is that we gather and analyze evidence. So what do I mean by that? So there are two types of evidence that we gather. One is qualitative and the other is quantitative. So when we're talking about qualitative evidence, these are things like perhaps complaints. So maybe you work at the local level and you're trying to analyze whether or not the very simple problem should be addressed, right? Should a stop sign be put in a neighborhood or not? So maybe what you're looking at is the number of complaints that local community members have submitted about needing this stop sign. Or maybe you're looking at police reports that identify accidents at this particular intersection. This could be interviews and focus groups with key informants. So you're trying to understand, is this a problem or not? And so you're talking to the people who are affected by it, who maybe are perpetrating the issue. You're talking to a variety of groups in an in-depth way. Maybe you're doing textual analysis of key documents. So maybe you're trying to analyze, for example, the Congress has just decided to do a greater investigation on Benghazi, right, and what happened. And so part of what they're doing is textual analysis. They're looking back at emails, they're looking back at documents that were passed around and released in the government, trying to decide whether or not the correct approach was taken, whether or not there was honesty in government about this issue. And this is a lot of what we do as policy analysts. So we go back and we look at what are the available documents and what kind of information do they tell us about whether or not there is a problem. On the other side, there's quantitative data. This is numerical data. So you might have official reports that have statistics in them. So when we think about the case of homelessness, for example, this might be the size of the homeless population. You might you're going to be looking at objective measures. So in the case of homelessness, you might have, the number of people who are sleeping on the streets versus the number of people who are being housed in shelters. That might be one way that you would assess whether or not homelessness was adequately being addressed by the city. And then on these objective measures, you're going to perform statistical analysis of this quantitative data. And so you try and understand the significance, statistical significance of the information and whether or not we have an indication of what's causing what. The focus in either case, either the qualitative or quantitative data, is that the sources are reliable. And we'll talk a little bit throughout the semester about what we mean by a reliable source. In the case of qualitative data, we're thinking about reliability in terms of the extent to which your source is really related to the problem and has some sort of expertise on it. And expertise doesn't have to be formal expertise. If we're talking about a stop sign, living at the intersection where the stop sign is being requested is a form of expertise, right? You know very clearly what is happening at that intersection. In contrast, somebody who lives, 10 miles away and has never even seen that intersection, still a resident, right? So maybe on the surface looks the same as that person who actually lives at the intersection. The person who lives 10 miles away is not a reliable source, right? They don't understand what's happening, even though they appear to have the same formal qualifications. On the quantitative side, we have reliable sources through government data, through a variety of different organizations that gather data. It's sort of a case-by-case analysis about the nature of the source. So for policy analysts, problem definition is, and this comes from Irwin, so it's defining the issue in clear and logical terms. So we're going to define key terms that are going to allow us to better understand things. We're going to outline problems in terms of explanatory variables. And so we're going to think about this in terms of independent and dependent variables. And if you've been in a science class, you should be familiar at some level with these terms. But a dependent variable is a thing that you're trying to explain, right? It's dependent on things outside of itself. So if you're trying to explain, for example, the size of the homeless population, then the size of the homeless population would be your dependent variable. And your independent variables might be how good the mental health care is in your area, whether or not there is a drunk tank or an addiction center, the extent to which there are shelters, maybe the economic conditions in your community, the size of the veteran population, etc., right? So these are all things that might actually cause a homeless population to increase or decrease. So we're thinking about this in terms of explanatory variables. And we're gathering and analyzing this data that verifies the validity and magnitude of the problem. So as I mentioned before, what we're trying to do is understand, is this a problem or not? How big is it? How serious is it? If it's just a small group, 3 or 4 people who say we really want a stop sign here, but it's not actually a problem, there aren't accidents, there aren't complaints, doesn't seem to be a lot of traffic here, right? Then maybe you say, look, this isn't really a place for our limited resources to go. Versus if we find that, oh yes, there actually was an accident last week and there have been many complaints and actually there's a lot of speeding through here and there are many children, then we decide, okay, the magnitude of this problem is pretty large and it's very valid, and so we need to address this issue. And so when we think about linking the political and applied problem definition, thinking about this is really important because they are related. And even though on the practitioner side and on the applied side we're trying to be objective, we're still influenced by the political or causal stories, right? There is no such thing as true objectivity. But they're also related in a couple of quite specific ways. So the first is attention. So the problem definition, problems don't become problems until someone identifies an issue as a problem, okay? Someone has to say, look, having homeless people on the street, so the homeless people were always on the street, okay? That was always a reality. But it's not until someone says, there are people who live on the street and that's not okay, right? Then it becomes a problem that people can pay attention to. And the reality is that politicians and the public often begin to focus on an issue after a causal story has been popularized, right? It's only after somebody says, yes, there is a problem, it's caused by party A, it should be fixed by party A, it affects party B, and here is the story that's around it. That's when we begin to see a lot of attention. Similarly, after there's a lot of attention, policy analysts are often asked to develop policy recommendations. So before homelessness, for example, let's continue on this homelessness issue. Homelessness as we know it today was not an issue until the 1980s, okay? And really, like, the way that we think about homelessness largely developed in the 1990s. And so prior to that point, there wasn't a lot of analysis about what the best way to address homelessness actually was. It wasn't until the media and the homeless themselves began to raise, or homeless advocacy organizations began to raise issue and began to raise awareness of the issue, that we began to talk about the best way to address these problems. Right? It took attention though, and that is this common denominator. And they also both shape the analysis. The causal story that develops in an analysis shapes the policy recommendations that develop, and whether it aligns with the dominant causal story influences how readily analysis is adopted, right? And so in both cases, in both the problem definition from the political and applied perspective, is really going to shape the analysis that ends up happening. So let's talk in greater depth about what a causal story actually is. And so Stone says this: causal theories, like other modes of problem definition, are efforts to control interpretations and images of difficulties. Political actors create causal stories to describe harms and difficulties, to attribute them to actions of other individuals and organizations, and thereby invoke government power to stop the harm. Like other forms of symbolic representation, causal stories can be emotionally compelling. They are stories of innocence and guilt, victims and oppressors, suffering and evil. Good political analysis must attend to all the strategic functions of causal interpretation. And so let's break this down, right? So causal, what do we mean by causal? A causes B, right? It's a story, so it's compelling, it's often emotional. The explanation about why an issue exists is not just, cut and dry, totally objective. No, this is an emotional appeal. And this is explaining why an issue is a problem or why it's not a problem. Who's affected? Who's to blame? Right? You're telling this story. And any good story has both a villain and a hero. But the most important part of this is that you are controlling interpretations, right? So you are framing the way that the public is thinking about an issue. And so when we think about this in general, people know a very limited amount of information about any given topic, okay? there are a few people who are going to know a lot about a policy area, but mostly the public knows very little. And so they're looking to people that they trust for information about how to think about something. And so when the media reports a causal story or a politician comes out with a causal story that gets a lot of play, this really influences the interpretation and how both the public and policymakers begin to think about the issue. So stories frame the way that we see things, right? They create boundaries on the way we think about an issue. They dictate the solution we think are appropriate, right? They set up the policy that's going to ensue. And causal stories are primarily conveyed by political, social, and economic elites. So each of us can develop a causal story, right? You can sit down and you can say, I think that underage smoking is caused by whatever you think it is caused by, right? You can all think of an explanation for why underage kids smoke or drink or do any other sort of what we would consider deviant behaviors. But nobody's listening to your causal story. Maybe your best friend, maybe you post something on Facebook, maybe your parents listen to you. But in general, you don't have a lot of power to transmit that causal story. In contrast, the political, social, and economic elites have the ear of the public. And so they are trying to shape the way that the public thinks about things by controlling their interpretation of the issue. And when we control the interpretation of the issue, let me reiterate that we also control the possible solutions that are considered. And that's where it becomes really important. And these causal stories are reinforced by the media. Who gets play and who doesn't, right? So if we think about our current economic problems in this country, and whether the causal story is or about how we should fix it is that we need to tax the rich to provide increasing tax revenue, or whether it's that we need to cut spending, those are causal stories, right? They are causal stories that get told by the different political elites, and then they get reinforced through the media. So if you watch the Fox News, then you're likely to hear a lot about needing to cut the deficit, right? Cut our deficit spending, cut our national debt, about irresponsibility in spending, about who is to blame for that irresponsibility. In contrast, if you listen to MSNBC or to NPR, you're more likely to hear the other side of it, right? Which is that we need to increase taxation, and we need to have those people who have more pay more, right? So importantly, causal stories describe harm and difficulty, right? So an issue, as I mentioned before, isn't considered a problem unless someone or something is being harmed and that harm is recognized and legitimated by society. So to take two more examples, if we think about the case of smoking, think about any movie that you've seen from the 1940s or 1950s, or even, like Mad Men. It's obviously not from the 40s or 50s, but it's portraying the 1950s. And what are we seeing in those movies, right? Pretty much everyone is smoking. Smoking is cool. Smoking is not even thought twice about, right? Because it hadn't yet become a problem. We didn't necessarily understand what the health implications were. We didn't have any kind of government intervention in trying to make sure people didn't smoke, right? This was just a fact of life. And it wasn't until we began to understand that smoking causes cancer and a myriad of other health problems that smoking became a problem. And it wasn't until the government sort of sold a story about its need to, for example, provide smoking cessation programs, and there was a public health, there was a compelling public health interest in addressing smoking, that it became something that was both acknowledged and legitimated as a real policy issue. And the same is true for the hole in the ozone layer, right? So today, we almost never hear about the hole in the ozone layer. and didn't become an issue until we had more advanced technology, and this became a real issue in the 1990s. Between the 70s and the 90s, right? And what we realized was that the chemicals that were in aerosols were going into our atmosphere and depleting our ozone, right? And so this became a problem pretty much overnight, or very, very quickly. And when I say it became a problem, obviously it existed prior to that point, but we weren't acknowledging or recognizing it. We weren't legitimating it as something that needed to be addressed. But once we did and we started to ban the chemicals that deplete the ozone, all of a sudden the problem has improved drastically, and we legitimated government intervention. But it was not until those things were considered a problem. If, for example, in 1950, the government had decided to make it illegal to smoke in the workplace, or God forbid, a bar, there would have been absolutely no support for that, right? Or maybe a few people, but on the whole, there wouldn't have been support because this was not seen as a problem. And so then an essential component of a causal story is describing the problem and the harm it's causing. So why is the issue a problem, and who is it a problem for? How is it affecting the group negatively? So if we take the case of smoking, what we're talking about is a problem that causes harm to those who smoke and those who are around secondhand smoking. We're talking about a public health problem in terms of the public health system having to pay for the cancer treatment or the diabetes treatment, or whatever it is that the smoking causes. And so it becomes a problem not just for those who are smoking or who are around secondhand smoke, but for society as a whole in trying to minimize and control our healthcare costs. And so we see this story, and this is a dominant story. So today there are very few people who would challenge this causal story of, smoking being this negative thing. And let me say that differently. There are very few people who would challenge the problem definition of smoking. On the other hand, there are many people who would challenge who is responsible for that problem. And this is the next part of the causal story. So what you're doing is attributing harm to the actions of others. So this is the most important deviation from a purely objective definition of problem, and that is assigning blame. So causal stories paint a picture where a problem is caused by someone or something who is responsible for that harm. And it results in, and those people are at fault for the resulting issues, right? And what that does is it allows us to develop policy aimed at the entity responsible, seek financial compensation, or press criminal charges. Or maybe it allows us to explain away the problem. So let's continue our smoking example. If we identify the who is to blame as the companies who produce cigarettes. So, for example, well, you fooled the public, you have done additives to make them more addictive, you caused all of these problems, then what is the natural reaction? It's to go after the big tobacco companies, right? It's to try and make them pay for their lies, quote unquote. Okay. If, on the other hand, we identify individual choices as the source of this problem, then the appropriate response, based on that blame, is perhaps to have smoking cessation programs. Perhaps it's to do what we do in many big cities, which is put a tremendous sales tax on it to reduce the likelihood that an individual is going to purchase a cigarette. Right, but what we see is that the causal story and who you identify as a person to blame changes the policy that we consider viable. And the final thing is that a causal story invokes government intervention. So causal stories must explain why the public should care, or why this is a societal issue. Right? Why is smoking something that government should intervene about? Why is it not just something that the individual should care about? And our answer to that particular question today is one, what we already talked about, which is the cost on our healthcare system. And two, the secondhand effect, right? That people who do not have any choice in being exposed to that cigarette smoke are nonetheless exposed to it. And so what we say is, look, you should be able to go into a bar, you should be able to go to work without being exposed to these toxic chemicals. And today, society, for the most part, identifies that causal story as being legitimate, as being, yes, government should intervene on this issue. And in order to justify government intervention, we have to say why the parties involved can't take care of it on their own, and why it isn't the private sector's responsibility to take care of the issue. So in the case of smoking, what we saw is that the private sector was really involved in the deception around smoking and in putting in additives and so forth that made cigarettes more addictive. And so they couldn't regulate themselves, right? They had proved that they could not regulate themselves. And we've already identified again why smoking wasn't an issue to take care of just on your own, because other people were being harmed by it. And so Stone identifies a couple of different types of causal stories. Again, you need to have read this. And so she identifies two dimensions. So we talk about actions, right? Whether or not they were done on purpose or not, and consequences. So whether or not we think about the outcomes of those actions as being what somebody meant to do or what they didn't mean to do, right? So you're thinking about this as a story that's being built. And what we come up with is a story where we identify a mechanical cause, an accidental cause, an intentional cause, and an inadvertent cause. So if you haven't done the reading, make sure that you look at this chart a little more carefully. In a mechanical cause, we have no will of their own, but are designed, programmed, or trained by humans to produce certain consequences. Right? So you might think of this as a drone, for example, or a robot, right, that we have trained to do, or, programmed to carry out some activity. So in this case, the will is purposeful. So whoever designed it has a purpose in mind, but it's carried out through other people, machines, social procedures, or routines that don't have any sort of control, right? So a recent example are child soldiers, right? So in many African nations, children are kidnapped or lured into armies and essentially brainwashed to become soldiers, right? To kill, to pillage, to do really awful things. And what the research has found is that these children, and what we all know, is that the children can't really make choices on their own, right? They're destitute, they're on their parents are afraid, someone takes them in, and then they brainwash them into believing that this is what they have to do, right? And so when we think about why are children involved in these wars, we can identify this mechanical cause. The next thing is intentional, right? So we directly assigns blame or praise or credit if it's a good thing. And what we say is that someone willfully and knowingly caused harm, creating an oppressor and victim dichotomy. Right? So politically, this is a good offense. Because it's really easy if you say, look, this person did something that was wrong and they knew that they were doing it. That is a really strong argument, but you don't want to be the one who's being accused of intentional harm, right? And so a current example is Chris Christie with his bridge scandal, right? And the claim is that he had his employees shut down a bridge in retaliation for city government who wouldn't support his campaign. And so he's being accused of this. There's still an ongoing investigation on this topic. But this is not, for him, it's certainly not politically good. It makes him look petty and so forth. But on the flip side, on the accuser side, this is a very compelling argument, right? It immediately makes you question, who is this Chris Christie character if he would cause all this inconvenience and so forth over such a petty thing? Then we have accidental cause, right? So these are phenomena that are devoid of purpose, either in their actions or consequences, and no one is responsible in the realm of fate, right? So if you're being blamed, this is the best defense you have. So yes, I did this thing, but it was a complete accident, right? In my household, I'm a very clumsy person. I break things a lot, okay? And my husband gets really frustrated by that because he's the one who ends up fixing many things. But and my defense, my causal story is, yes, I broke that. I 100% broke that, but it was an accident. I didn't mean to break it, right? I tripped or I dropped it or I couldn't see how this, A would affect B, right? And that's a pretty compelling argument, particularly because he knows I'm not intentionally breaking things, right? But an example that we might think about was this past winter. We had our big ice storm here in Michigan, and it caused electricity to go out over the Christmas holidays, for some people up to almost 2 weeks. And there was a lot of anger and frustration with the Board of Water and Light. And there were a lot of questions about whether they handled this appropriately, right? So people are trying to develop a causal story about why the electricity went out. And they're pointing a finger at Board of Water and Light and saying, hey, you didn't handle this correctly. But what Board of Water and Light is saying is this was completely out of our control. We didn't cause this ice storm. We didn't want this ice storm. And the reality is that it took out half of the city's infrastructure, which took 50 years to build, and we're not going to be able to repair it overnight. And in fact, if you think about it in those terms, about taking out 50% of the infrastructure, the fact that we got it running in 10 days is pretty remarkable, right? So it's a great defense if you're being blamed for something that is that's happened. And the last one is inadvertent cause. So these are consequences that are predictable but are unforeseen. So you can be positive, but we usually focus on the negative, and can be unforeseen policy consequences. For example, ignorance, carelessness, recklessness. And so if you extend my personal example about being klutzy, sometimes I do things, I begin to do things, and my husband will say, Melanie, stop. You're like, can't you see that if you do this thing, you're going to break it or you're going to spill the water or whatever, right? Because I don't have a lot of spatial sense, so I really can't see that. But it's an inadvertent cause. Somebody else, he could see very clearly what is going to happen, and it's my ignorance to that issue or to that consequence that prevents me from being able to see it or stop it. So if we think about it in a policy term, a current example would be gentrification, which happens in a lot of big cities, right? So oftentimes what happens is we want to create some sort of economic incentives for people, right? We want to improve the economic conditions of a community, and so we invest in that community. But one of the unfortunate consequences is that oftentimes what ends up happening is that the improvements to the community price out those people who are currently living there. The people have to leave and move to poorer neighborhoods, and so the neighborhood, the physical structure improves, but the people's lives who are living there don't improve, right? New people move in, middle class people move in, and now all you've done is created a nice neighborhood for the middle class while the poor still have to go somewhere else. Importantly, causal stories aren't static. So what this means is that they can change and that both sides often have an incentive to shift a causal story. So those trying to assign blame want to make an intentional causal argument, and those trying to avoid blame want to make an accidental causal argument. So if we think about this is a Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant in Japan. And so when the hurricane originally happened, there was very much an accidental causal argument, right? So this horrible thing happened. We did not expect it to cause the breaches in the security on the nuclear power plant, but it did, right? Unfortunately, those problems have continued on, and there's still sort of radiation problems and nuclear seepage and things of that nature. And so there are many people who are shifting that causal story and saying, look, this is no longer an accident, right? The original thing was an accident, but now this is mismanagement, or this is, the people at the plant aren't disclosing the extent of the problem. Um, you have these there are real shifts in the way that that we're talking about this incident. Of course, the people who own the power plant are still saying, no, no, this is accidental cause, right? They don't want to have that blame shift. And where the truth lies, as in most things, is probably somewhere in the middle, right? Um, but the important part about a causal story is that we're not necessarily looking for the objective truth. We're telling a story that identifies who to blame, right? I think, though, something that's very important is that most issues have complex causes. So when we think about homelessness, going back to that example, we could say, well, homelessness is caused by a lack of public housing, right? There isn't enough affordable housing, so people end up homeless. And that is true. There are some people who end up homeless because they can't afford the market rate of housing. There isn't enough low-income housing or public housing to accommodate it. But it's also true that people end up on the streets because they're mentally ill, or because they're addicts, or because they're there just for a very short period of time. They had some kind of a crisis, lost their job, ended up there for a week or two. Some people, not very many, but some choose to be homeless. They prefer that to a life that's more constrained by conventional social norms. And so there are multiple causes. And what that means is that there has to be complex solutions as well, right? So they have to be systems to solve modern problems that are complex to address the complex nature of issues. And, excuse me. And so we see that that we have a lot of things to try and address these complex things, right? So we have institutional causes of issues. For example, we talk about this concept of institutionalized racism. These are policies that have racial implications that negatively affect racial minorities, but that they've been institutionalized. We can talk about historical causes. We can talk about the contextual things on the ground, right? But complex causes aren't particularly politically useful, right? So if we say, yeah, look, homelessness is caused by 800 different things, and part of it is society, and part of it is individual, and part of it is the history of our policies, and part of it is the institutions we've developed, it's really difficult then to say, well, who is supposed to fix this problem? Who's to blame for it? Who's supposed to pay for the solution, right? And so this creates a tension between policy analysts or social scientists and politicians, right? Because the politically useful thing is to be able to identify a single source, a person or a thing or a group to blame. And what that can also often mean is that where a social scientist or policy analyst says, here's the solution to your issue, it has to be something that is very diverse, right? You need something that addresses all of these multiple causes. A politician may say, okay, look, I'm going to adopt this one or two things that are politically useful, right? Where I can really identify blame and I can figure out who's going to pay for it. And what that means is that oftentimes policy analysts or social scientists' recommendations are not fully taken. And that can lead to a limited ability to actually address the issues. And so how causal stories relate to policy? And this quote, I think, really nicely sums it up. So if adequate investigation reveals that most work accidents happen because workmen are fools, like Frank Kuroshik, who reached into danger in spite of every precaution taken to protect him, then there is no warrant for direct interference by society in the hope of preventing them. If, on the other hand, investigation reveals that a considerable proportion of accidents are due to insufficient concern for the safety of workmen on the part of their employers, then social interference in some form is justified. Right? This, I think, really nicely summarizes this concept that we've been talking about throughout this lecture, which is that the story that we tell, who we blame, how we identify the problem, very much dictates whether or not we should develop policy and what policies we consider as viable possibilities. And so let's look at this in practice. Okay, so we're going to use this example of smoking that we've already sort of talked about. And these are advertisements that we see in pop culture. Okay, so we see causal stories all over the place in pop culture, in advertising, in news stories, in lyrics of music, videos, all over the place, all right? And so we have some different competing causal stories in these advertisements. So in this one, we have this causal story about a helpless child who's being made victim, suffocated, a bag over his head made of smoke, right, by the parent or old adult figure, right? So this child has no control over the situation. The adult is to blame. The adult is control of the situation, and clearly the problem needs to be fixed. The ad is saying they're killing their child, right? This ad is putting the causal blame on the individual themselves, right? So this person is still young but old enough to be making the decision to smoke. And it's saying, look, this is equivalent to committing suicide. So you're putting a gun to your own head, and it's essentially saying, right, this is ridiculous. Like, you're to blame for your own health problems, your own situation, and you need to stop it. Now, in contrast, let's watch this video, and this is a PSA on smoking. And this is a very different type of a causal story. So in contrast to these very individualistic causal stories that is putting the blame on the individual, that PSA puts the blame very squarely on the shoulders of the tobacco industry and saying, look, these deaths are on your hands. You are to blame. You should fix this problem. And so we see these different types of competing causal stories on many issues. And which causal story becomes dominant very much dictates the types of policies that develop. Now, the reality is that you can have multiple causal stories that are functioning at the same time, right? So smoking is a good example of that, where we see litigation against the tobacco industry on the one hand and efforts to minimize the ability of tobacco to function, right? They're not, for example, not allowed to have advertisements on television or target minors, or you have major taxes, etc. And then you also have efforts on the individual side to limit smoking cessation programs, ad campaigns like this, like public service announcements to try and educate the public about the dangers of smoking, right? So this is the case where you recognize two different causal stories, one that puts the individual blame and one that puts the more systemic corporate blame, and two different types of policy to address those things. But when we think about it, there could be other stories as well, right? So we could, for example, break down this individual story and talk about why people begin smoking to begin with, right? Feeling cool in school, or feeling like they need an escape from life, or they want to rebel, or right. We could develop all of these different causal arguments and develop different interventions to address each of those different causal arguments. So even though two causal arguments have been recognized and acted upon, it doesn't mean that there aren't many others that are not gaining dominance. And in many cases, you do have a really single dominant causal story. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a strong understanding of what a causal story is. As I mentioned before, you do need to do your reading. And our next set of reading and lectures, or the last lecture of the week, will be applying this notion of a causal story to the case of immigration. And I will do, the way that our applications will work is that I will cover the policy topic in a limited way. And then I will have questions at the end that will be for you to think about, for you to be able to apply the readings to this topic. And so I'm not going to do all of the work for you in terms of applying these concepts to a case study, but I'll lay out the framework for you. And so we'll go over that in our next lecture. As a reminder, your requirements for this week. So you have your readings, which are your introduction to policy analysis, causal stories, and case study on immigration. You have your lectures, which you presumably already watched your introduction. You just finished the problem definition. And now your last one is this immigration and causal stories. Your pre-class survey is due by Thursday, as is your plagiarism test and your first discussion post. And finally, you need to have your response post done by Sunday, May 18th. So I hope that you have a great rest of your day, and I will talk to you soon. Take care.